Word. Well, welcome to this episode of Clinically Press. We are back on with Rusty Murphy, who is a co-founder of Rising Athletes. We had him on previously talking about kind of his experience coming up through high school and collegiate athletics, and we're kind of going to flip the script a little bit with this one, and he's going to ask more of the questions. And this is going to be part of a longer series, just kind of talking about training and nutrition and recovery and injury and illness and all these things that go into being, I mean, just an athlete in general. I guess it doesn't really have to be high school or collegiate, but Rusty put together an expansive list. Kudos. I was like almost overwhelmed trying to organize it, of questions that he's come up with across the time. And we were just talking off air about he went to a coaching conference, and the conversations around training were questionable. And so wanting to just dive in more. So, yeah, we can just jump right into it if you want.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. So I mean, part of this is really to just give, parents, students, coaches, trainers, whoever might be the first thing that comes to mind to me is like high school programming where they don't necessarily have paid professionals on staff,
Right.
especially these days. There's a lot of, you know, parents that have a corporate job that come down and coach, or teachers that are doing other activities. So that don't have time or resources to kind of dig into this kind of stuff. So um, the goal is to kind of break it down, keep it simple, ask some of those questions that you can Google and get a gazillion answers for, and
Right. Right.
kind of just give them our scientific take on it, with your background and professional, and then I can give any feedback on stuff that I went through at UW Lacrosse and the programming that you and Dr. Wright built, and kind of go from there. So with that being said, so today's performance training episode, this might be a 10 episode series or it might be a 2 episode series. So
Yeah.
we'll
We'll see how many we get through.
yeah, exactly. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is warming up. At lacrosse we had much different warm ups than I had in high school. Some people get in one big line and stretch the arms, stretch the legs, toe touches, jog it down, and then head up to the weight room. Can you just touch on the importance of preparation, and if you could build a simple high school program, maybe just for generalized, not for football, not for anything, but just in general, how would you kind of break down a warm up before hitting the gym, and how would you differentiate it from weights to sprinting? I'll just kind of start it there and we can
Yep.
dive in as you go.
Yeah, so the one thing that we did, and this was led by Dr. Glenn Wright, is we got rid of the word warm up, just because a lot of people, as you kind of referenced, the connotation was, oh, I go jog around for 30 seconds or take a couple laps and then do a couple static stretches and off we go. Or, if you get to the point where I am with my workouts, it's if I'm squatting that day, my warm up is the lesser weighted squats and we call
Yeah.
it good, which I do not recommend for people that are trying to be athletic. It just happens when you get older. And then you figure out you got to warm up again when you start getting hurt. But anyway, so we started referring it to as the pillar preparation and movement preparation. And pillar preparation was really focusing on getting your hips, your core, and your shoulders all moving through kind of controlled exercises, but just getting them active and going, whether it be through mobility or just almost think of like a rehab exercise, just simple, easy, nothing high intensity, just to get things moving. And this pillar concept really got big with Exo Sports Performance. And instead of saying quote unquote core, they used pillar because it went shoulders to hips and tied everything in between. So those were a lot in place, very controlled, on all fours in a quadruped position, doing some hip abduction or rotation, just getting them warmed up, doing some eyes, Y's, or T's with your shoulders, maybe getting into a plank position and doing a few things there, again, just to get it moving. The next step of that would be the movement prep, which was still focusing on a lot of those areas, but adding some moving to it. So walking lunges with rotation or walking world's greatest stretch, which we can link up to some of these things when we put this out. But walking straight leg hamstring stretches with it, and then getting to the next one of getting your heart rate up. So doing some pillar marches or pillar skips, which is just what they are, just going in a straight line or going side to side. Again, now just to get the heart rate up, maybe try and get a little bit of a sweat going and doing some of those things. And that was part of getting ready to go into uh, the sports performance center for a lift. And so that's really focused there. And I think the power in it is, and you can comment on this, is when the whole team is doing it. And it's hard if you don't have a dedicated coach, but none of them are so complex it can't be done by anybody else. Like, don't make it harder than it seems. Um, but doing it as a group where everybody's doing it at the same time, it's organized, to me, just adds to a better quality, effort by everyone for the most part. Sure, you'll have a few that don't, but it's not just
Right.
like everybody randomly doing it and then popping into the weight room as it works for them. Some of
Yeah.
the differences from that, say for like you, because you had experience in this too, like for a football practice, some of the similar things where we do maybe a much more abbreviated pillar prep just because you guys had already been out there moving around a little bit and kind of some pre-practice, nothing high intensity, but just moving. And then we would almost kind of go into an advanced movement prep where I believe it kind of evolved where you would do some reps of that and then we progressively and then you would, jog it out for 20 yards or whatnot. And as we were doing that, that jog became progressively faster. And what our goal was to prepare your body for the next sprint you were going to have to do in practice. So we
Right.
wanted to make sure that the first time you did that wasn't in an uncontrolled in quotes environment where you're reacting to a running back or a wide receiver. Your body was prepped by doing it where you could had full control over the scenario. So those are some of the things that like the real intentionality, nothing complicated, but just being intentional about it, I think made a big difference. Um, and I think it benefited a lot of people. I think a lot of people started feeling better, a little less sore. Movement got a little bit easier, and I think we saw that in some injury rates as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we were doing it, depending on the time of year, whether it was a 4 day a week routine, a 3 day with two run, whatever it might
Yep,
be, you end up doing that routine, that pillar prep, your movement prep every single day, no matter what the workout is. So
yep,
you're logging like in an off season, so to say, you're logging, 200 days of movement prep, which is really just focused on like getting loose and stretching those spots where if you're just doing plain old Jane warm ups, like you're not hitting that at all. So I think the compounding of doing that every single or every other day, whatever it was, really made a difference in how easier it was to move. All of a sudden, your hips are loosening up because you're loosening them up every day intentionally.
yep.
And then after 2 years of doing that, it's like, wow, I'm moving so much better, easier. You're not as sore. Um, the other thing I wanted to hit on as well is, at least from my standpoint, it seemed that there was at least I would say I don't know 10 to 20% of the warm up would be focused on what we were doing, right? So
Yep.
kind of similar to football, how you're running in a controlled position, or sprinting, and you're doing that before you have to sprint and like make a tackle in practice, right? Um, I felt like it was kind of similar for the weight room. Like if we were doing heavy squats, so to say, we were
For
probably
sure.
doing, jump squats. We were doing controlled, body weight squats. Is it the same idea? We had football for this example, but doing it in a controlled environment before you're adding the stress of whether it's contact or heavy weight before you actually go and do that stuff right after.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're getting ready for what you're doing. So if it's a heavy lower body day, like doing a bunch of upper body warm up is that's fine, but we're not really prepping you up for it. And that kind of brings into the idea, of quote unquote sports specific.
Right.
Our approach was always not necessarily like this is sports specific training. Our goal in the SPC was to make the individual in whatever sport as athletic as we could for them to then apply that athleticism to their sport through the drills and things that the coach did. Like that was always our goal. That being said, yes, like we're not going to train a volleyball player or a soccer or a women's basketball player or any of those the exact same as we would the football player in the weight room, but we also can focus on different things because, the only person on a football team that could equate to the shoulder of a volleyball player, maybe the quarterback, just from the repetitive overhead, that maybe. So there's definitely other things we want to take into consideration that we might focus on more sport to sport. But then also with this pillar prep, every day doesn't have to be the same. It
Right.
doesn't have to be the exact same quote unquote warm up every single time. You can have a couple different versions based on your days. And it's been interesting because, like with you all, college athletes, we changed it up quite a bit. Now,
Mm.
thankfully, we had the coaches there to help, teach that and do that. But we did it to keep you all engaged, so you
Yeah.
weren't just doing the same thing over and over again. Well, interesting when we started working with the firefighters, they didn't like the change because they didn't have somebody there coaching them to go through it, and then they had to learn something else. So they wanted more consistency. So we changed it a lot less frequently and a lot slower. And so you just got to find what works for you. And so that was like interjecting similar exercises to make sure we're still getting accomplished, but also not overwhelming people at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think it goes the same for, I'm sure, high school athletes are probably even, you have to change it up even more, just
Potentially, yeah.
every day, but I definitely think it's worth it. Um, all right. Well, that was good. Let's move on. I guess maybe move back a little bit in the process. I wanted to
Sure.
get warm up out of the way because I think it's just a very um, people just kind of go past that topic very easily. But
Yes.
so in terms of structuring a plan, and I'm thinking of high school strength coaches when I think of this, whether it's any sport. And this is going to be tough for you because I know a lot of this is very sport specific, but
Sure.
um, and time of year specific, right? So this is going to be a wide open question, but how would you, I guess, how would you go about structuring? Um, maybe let's start with this. How would you structure in season versus out of season, whether it's movement and running or lifting? Maybe around contests or around practice. How would you control that? And obviously, it's much different, but or maybe I'm trying to think of the easiest way to do this because
I got a
it's so
couple of ways we can go with this. I
yeah.
think.
Yeah, maybe we could do a quarter thing, like in season, off season, leading up. I don't know, but how would you structure running and weights? Kind of around season and then off season. I'll leave it from there and let you answer and interject when I can.
Yep. So the hardest thing, especially with high school athletes, is if the athlete plays in more than one sport. Because it's just really hard to get in some really good strength training because you literally finish up a football season, and I believe in most cases basketball season's already started, or it
Yeah,
starts the next week.
yeah,
And so it's hard in that regard to truly dedicate some time to the strength and conditioning with that. So some of this is all in context of like multi-sport athletes, great thing, highly support it, keep doing it, and it's figuring out some of those other things around it when you do get a little bit of a break with it, but also keeping in mind recovery, which we will talk about in a whole other episode.
yeah,
Um, but with that, say we had somebody who was more football specific with it, just for the sake of an ease of an example.
yeah,
What we found is 2 days a week during season is as much as you need for in season. Um, we even chatted about sometimes going down to 1 day a week. We threw that out there. We ended up not, but it was a consideration. The biggest goal in season is to maintain as much strength and power as possible. It's not necessarily to get bigger and stronger, because our main focus is A, keeping you healthy, and B, keeping you recovered from week to week. And so, for college football, it was play on Saturday, so it was a lift Tuesday, Thursday. High school obviously plays typically on Friday, would be probably a shift to Monday and Wednesday at the latest with that. But if you probably remember, like they were short lifts, 45 minutes at the max. It was going in. It wasn't super heavy, but it progressed to getting pretty heavy to maintain that strength. But it was
yeah,
short, high intensity, so we weren't necessarily super taxing, but we were able to maintain that. Um, so that was what we did there, and it kind of ramped up during season, and we paid attention as much as we could of what's what is a key game that we know is going to, all of them are key, but some are bigger than others, like leading up to a whitewater game for us, we wanted to make sure we were as, healthy as we could because we needed everybody healthy to be able to try and win that one. Some other
Right.
games, yes, we wanted everybody to be healthy, but we thought we could push a little harder to maintain some strength, and we still were going to perform at a high level in order to win. The biggest learning thing for me, especially early on when we were in a coaching transition, that I didn't realize, and I learned a ton from Dr. Wright on this, is the importance of that recovery after the season. And that so many people, if you don't have a great year, you want to get in and start working as hard as possible. And I get it. I would be of that same mindset too. But it is imperative to give yourself at least a month, if not more, of recovery. And that's not doing anything, but it's dialing it way back to allow your body to heal, get back to it so you're ready to start training come the next year, the next season. So for us, that was usually, finishing up sometime in late November, even potentially early December now. And we would do a lot of recovery through the month of December, still doing some stuff, a lot of addressing bilateral asymmetries by doing a lot of unilateral work. So by that, split squats, lunges, single arm presses, things like that to just kind of try and balance some things out. And then we really focus on January to be our start, if you will, of that next phase. I believe what we ended up doing, and it's been a couple of years now, is we would start off with 4 days a week, which isn't required. I think three is plenty. But again, for especially younger athletes, they want to feel like they're doing something, and that's understandable. So splitting it up over 4 days is what gets the buy-in. That's what we do. So we would do a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday lift. And we built in some conditioning stuff on those Tuesdays and Thursday mornings. But then ultimately, we did that for several blocks of the month. And then a lot of the conditioning, I say that in quotes, it was agility, it was basic jumping, it was some energy system development. So tempo runs, there was no sprinting in early January and February or March or anything along those lines. Because if we look at kind of how long things last, speed doesn't hold on for very long in terms of the adaptations you make. So training speed in January and expecting it to show up in August or September, it just
Yeah.
won't. So we wanted to build a good base so when we were ready to get to that, it was your body was going to be prepared for it. So then, again, talking more college, and I don't know what the rules are with high school anymore in terms of any spring practices. We would
Yeah.
drop down to 3 days a week. We'd drop the conditioning when spring practices would start. So it was 3 days of lifting, complemented by practice, which again was more focused on drills and player development. Not as much, obviously you're not doing scout type stuff like you would in the fall,
Right.
but then in the summer, that's when it really kind of switched over again to it was 3 days a week lifting, and then the conditioning stuff really started again. We would play the base first, so it was longer tempo runs, more agility drills, and then as the season got closer, that's when we started ramping up the speed type stuff to get people ready for the demands that were going to be placed on their body with it. So honestly, 4 days is probably the max, especially if you're doing the hard work and really the strength stuff for most athletes. And I say this for any sport in the off season should really just be a combination of kind of a strength block and a hypertrophy block. Back to a strength block to a hypertrophy block because there's just so much development happening in each of those athletes. There's no need to complicate it. Sure, there could be a time where we focus on quote unquote explosive strength and things like that. Sure. But
Mhm.
really just building up the base of the athlete is going to be what most people need.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind, could you talk a little bit? Because I know this was big in our program, but could you talk about ESD, energy system development? I think I
Yep.
got that right. And kind of explain that and maybe give that a full, you kind of already touched on it, but in terms of laying the foundation in January,
Yep.
the first week of August, we're all out sprinting. We're doing harder tempo runs. You know, can you just give a kind of how that phase works building up to the season, and then maybe if there's anything in season that to maintain, that sort of thing?
Yep. So energy system development is just a fancy word for conditioning. Again, we stole this from Exo Sports Performance, but we do that with the utmost flattery to them because they're one of the best in the world at what they do. But all we would so what we focused on in the spring is we'd have a lateral day and a linear day, and that was working on single leg jumps, double leg jumps to just work on building some athleticism, work on some body control, really getting people to understand how their bodies move. So then they were able to then apply that to what they were doing. So we had everybody from the skill guys to the linemen doing it because we just, again, thought building a better athlete to then apply it directly to what those positions were with their coaches was going to be our best. And so what we would do for conditioning or ESD at the beginning it was literally what were they probably like 55 or 60-yard tempo runs, and we would the bigger guys we'd go slower. They'd have a shorter distance, same time, shorter distance versus skill guys would just be a little bit longer, same time. But what we would do is basically have you run either in a 10 or 12-second thing. Again, it wasn't an all-out sprint because it was only 50 to 60 yards, so you don't need to all-out sprint.
I was
But
gonna say
then
the
you
same
would,
thing. It was like a jog, right?
yep, it
Or
was a
you
fast
know,
jog.
in between jog and run, way
Yep,
before sprinting is not in mind. This is like a 12-second, 50 yards, working on form
and you
going in.
guys would get yelled at if you went too fast.
Yeah. If it's 12 seconds, you got a coach waiting there saying, 10, 11. And if you're
Yeah,
past that 11, it's like, hey, slow it down.
yep. But then you would circle back around, almost like the junk, kind of shuffle, speed walk, and you'd get depending on the day 20 to 40 seconds of recovery. Then you get back on the line. So all we were doing there is just building up the cardiovascular system to be able to hit these repeated reps. The goal was not to crush anybody. It wasn't to make anybody puke. That was never any of the intention with any of the ESD or the conditioning stuff, because ultimately that's probably going to end up leading somebody to failure. And so that is all we did in the beginning. And we progressed it. We made it a little bit harder, cut down recovery time, maybe cut down the time by a second or two for the run. So we're still building that up. But that's ultimately what we do at the end of all of the other work we would do, which was also bringing in some fatigue. But again, it was just laying that base to build up so that you were in good shape for spring ball. That was another to build up through there to get in better shape to then get ready for the summer where we really started building up, contributing to the base, like you mentioned, longer tempo runs, a little longer time, but the goal there, but then also building in that sprinting because that's what we're going to need to do to perform on the field or the court or whatever it may be.
Exactly. Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad we talked about that because ESD, they might hear and be like, what is that?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
conditioning with like an asterisk, right? Like we're not guys aren't throwing up in January. They might throw up in summer if they haven't done anything all year, but
Right.
to slowly build that foundation. So when summer, and that's the other thing too, summer comes around, it's 80 degrees and, on the field, it's nice out and it's easier than if we didn't do anything. We just lifted all spring and then jumped into, 110-yard tempo
Yep.
runs and that sort of thing. So, awesome. So, um, I'm going to give you kind of a situation here. So again, thinking this is kind of more high school in my head, but
Yep.
how would you structure a week of workouts for multi-sport athletes? If and I know you touched on this because it's really hard, but if you had to, and I have my example here is a football player who plays
Yep.
basketball during the heart or part of the big time football off season. So if you had to build a week for them, I think they have 2 games and probably practice every night. The 3 they don't have games. How would you go about that?
Yeah, so for me, conditioning would be pulled from all of that in general. You're going to get enough of that. If for some reason we needed to do some extra, it would be unloaded. It would be on an assault bike or some version of that type of equipment where we're doing something, some sort of interval training to not load, the body anymore that we need to in those regards. Again, the basketball seasons get tougher because of, again, you know the multi game weeks with what it is. So if it's mostly Wednesday, Friday, or whatever it may be. It would be trying to get in probably a little longer lift on that Monday. So we got a couple days of recovery from the last game, but we're still a couple days in between. Um, Depending on working with the coach, if that you could get something in on that Thursday, it would be extremely short. It would not be heavy, lower body. It would probably be, which we might talk about, a pull variation, just to continue to keep that those type of movements ticking at a high level, really focusing on that force. Maybe we do a few vanity things just to, keep everybody feeling good about themselves, but getting some, stimulation there, but ultimately making sure. So that one for me would be under a half an hour. Could even be, after a short practice, if there was one in between where you just go in and get it done, quick. If they do it during the day, great, but just something where you're not going to feel super fatigued after practice, or if you do it before, you're not going to go into practice and be like, wow, I'm so tired from that. Not the
Yeah.
goal. Yeah.
Right.
And so again, it'd be really focusing on that continued maintaining as much strength as possible, not a lot of volume, but focusing on intensity within that to keep those levels up, while just keeping you as healthy and recovered as we can from the demands of the sport.
Awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into kind of the actual in the weight room stuff.
Yep.
So the first one is apparently more touchy than I thought, but should I teach power slash hang cleaning in my program? Why or why not?
There are a lot of arguments back and forth on this, and it depends on who you come from, who's a purist when it comes to USA weightlifting, in that regard. We did not, as I think we talked about on the previous episode, and this again was driven by Dr. Wright, who, with the previous head coach, there was a little bit of a disagreement there because where they had come from, it was a lot of power cleans and things like that. How I argue it is the power clean, hang clean, snatch, all of those motions are extremely technical lifts, and they're meant to be. There are people that go and practice their, it is their career, and it is tweaking every single thing with it. And so it's the balance of what is the cost versus reward and the risk of doing those and taking the time to teach to do it properly. In theory, if you're doing a proper power clean, like you're cleaning it and you're dropping into that front squat and then standing up. You don't see that very often when people are doing a quote unquote clean of some sort. It's literally just getting it up to their shoulders in a standing position. So are we truly even actually doing the real exercise as we say it? So what we ended up doing was a multitude of variations, of different pulls. So it all looked like we were going to do a power clean or a hang clean, but we just eliminated the catch. So we would do a low pull. So you're literally just kind of almost like a power shrug to a degree. We'd do a high pull where you're actually getting, sorry if people are just listening to this, where you're actually coming up like you're about to catch it, but you don't throw your elbows underneath to do it. And they actually found, I believe Dr. Wright was part of this research at UWL, that the same amount of power was generated from all of these pull variations as you were to actually doing the power clean.
Yeah.
And for me, coming from the athletic training side, the reduction in risk of injury is huge. Again, previous coaching staff, they were doing some max out stuff with it. And we had a handful of guys that caught their thumb weird, caught their wrist weird. Well, now you go and injure a thumb and wrist, you can't lift anything with that hand 2 to 4 to 6 weeks. And so, was it really worth the risk? For what reward did we get from it? Where we can potentially load up more on these clean variations, or even the same amount of weight, get the same amount of power as proven by science, and get the outcomes we want to
Yeah.
without spending however long we need to teaching the lift. If people do, I've got no issue with it, but I think you can get so much more accomplished if we go that other route and you maybe build it in later. But to have, a freshman high schooler come in and, you in theory should be spending like a month or more teaching them how to do it unless they just pick it up, versus you're just able to go. And teaching them is hard because, like, I'm sure you've messed with it. Like, if you have just a little bit of weight on the bar, it feels so weird because you can just muscle it up.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to teach the true technique when you're starting with lightweight. And then when you
Hmm.
get the heavy stuff, like it's a whole different world. And so again, I think those pull variations for me makes so much more sense to not have someone injure a hand or a thumb or a wrist and then not be able to do anything versus we do
Yeah.
that and then we can just program in front squats
Mhm.
and still get that benefit too.
Yeah, I see the same thing. Like even on Twitter, when you look at SEC weight room, pump up video, you still see guys catching it at, maybe the knee is slightly bent a little bit. It's
Sure.
like that's awesome. They're really strong. They're freaks, but
Right.
they got nothing out of what they just did there. Maybe a little bit in their forearms. They're not. If
They
you
didn't
watch,
get I don't think they got extra by catching it. Sure, they got all the power to get it there, which is great, but I don't know that like that extra catch really made like them a better athlete.
yeah, exactly, and
Cool video though, but yes.
yeah. Yeah, and I think too, when you think about when you are gonna load up heavy on power cleans, or if you are power cleaning in your program, when is that gonna be? It's gonna be late July, early August, and it's gonna be, if you're doing it in season, it's gonna be right before the playoffs. So you talk about the 2, 4, 6 weeks out because Johnny caught his thumb weird. It's like, well, Johnny's your middle linebacker, and you lost him for the next 4 weeks. He's missing early camp, or he's missing, whatever practice and whatnot for early playoffs.
Yeah, he's
So it's
trying to tackle somebody with a club, which never
yeah,
works out as
he
well
did
as
the
it
club,
should.
just because of one thing in the weight room. So good. I'm glad we talked about that because that helps. And I wanted to clear that deck before I ask my next question here.
Fair.
My next question is what main exercises should every athlete be doing in the weight room, and what exercises aren't needed for sport performance? Because I think people get confused, especially at the high school level, and I'm sure in some college programs, of sport performance versus looking really good in the mirror.
Right.
Could you clear that up in terms of, like, because I know you talked about it should be, you think of like the kid playing basketball, like half hour, it should be four main lifts most likely, or maybe six, depending on what kind of blocks you have set up. But what are some of the main things that you should be getting taken care of, and what are the things that's like, sure, good for the mirror, the vanity, like you said, but maybe not for really improving sport performance in him going forward, or her going forward.
Yep. So really a lot of your basic, squat and its variations. So we did focus a lot more on back squat. We throw front squat in every once in a while. The pull variations that we talked about as well. Different pressing variations. There's a lot of utility, obviously, to bench press. I'm a huge proponent of dumbbell bench press for a lot of reasons. Nothing bench, I would still program in, but if you've got somebody that's got a shoulder that aches or some other things, there's just a lot more you can do with dumbbells in terms of kind of where your position is. So I wouldn't hesitate, and I would definitely program both of them in. But if you're causing somebody more pain while they're bench pressing, why? Let's figure out another option for it. With the squat variations, big fan of split squats and different variations there. Lunges with that. RDLs, I think, should be a staple lift of every program. It was hugely beneficial for me personally, and just I think for so much prevention or injury risk reduction for hamstrings, it's good. Um, Tying in some Nordic curls. I like a lot of rows. I think one issue we see with a lot of people um, is they get overdeveloped through pushing, bench press, etc. Um, it's kind of a loose rule of thumb. You should probably have like two pull exercises for every push. A lot of that's going to be with shoulder health and everything there, just to kind of keep posture set. And honestly, I think it makes you look bigger. Especially if you got a bigger back. So I think that's worth doing. So those are definitely some of the main key ones there, and just figuring out where that fits within the role of the season is going. Um, One that I'll give you one that I would do and one that I wouldn't do, and I've pulled this from a lot of the people. I would definitely incorporate hex bar deadlift, which, if we want to get technical, is really more of a squat. But
Mhm.
just by where you're pulling it from, they call it the deadlift. I would not ever have an athlete conventional deadlift. It's too technical. There's too much risk for injury, similar to the power clean. And again, the risk versus the reward is way too high for me for something I can get a lot of the similar value from a hex bar deadlift and an RDL. In terms of kind of that, focusing on the things that it does, especially with some posterior chain development. So I would almost never have anybody. I will never have anybody traditional deadlift. Me personally, I did a bunch because I was doing some powerlifting programming. I'm now 38, and it became less fun and started hurting more, and so I've just
Yeah.
stopped. I've moved into heavy RDLs instead, to kind of maintain that. I won't probably ever conventionally deadlift again unless I need to show somebody that I can still do it, which may happen at some point. We'll see. But that is, I would not do that for an athlete. One that I try and remember a lot of athletes, and like a knee extension machine, great for post-op knee surgery,
Mhm.
worthless for athletic performance. Similar concept with like a hamstring curl on one of those things. Fine for some rehab stuff, and if for some vanity things, really not going to contribute to your athletic performance in any kind of way. And some of that stuff, you know, yes, the bicep curls and things like that. You want bigger biceps, row really heavy.
Yeah.
Is honestly what it's going to do. But also, that being said, I think the biggest evolution I saw in our programming, and by ours I mean Dr. Wright's, is when he started with it was purest in its form. So there was none of that stuff in
Yeah.
it. And I think he found out over the time of like it was worth, basically throwing you guys a bone to do some of those vanity things and have fun with it because it was a great team builder. It helped increase buy-in. Nobody felt guilty about doing it. And it just ultimately made his life easier in trying to get people to commit to it. So there's definitely a time and a place for that stuff. And as a coach, in the strength and condition, you can always come up with a reason for the lift. Maybe instead of straight bicep curls, we're doing hammer curls so we can build up some forearm strength too. Well, that could make for good things for a lot of reasons as well. So you
Yeah.
could definitely come up with some of those things. But then other like lat pull down slash pull ups, all basics are what you need. Behind the neck isn't going to do, a lat pull down behind the neck isn't going to make you a better athlete. You may feel in a different thing, but unless you're like a bodybuilder trying to focus on certain aspects of your back, I don't know that it's worth some of the risk of just getting in a weird position. I see that now when I go to the gym and everybody's doing these hyper specialized movements, and that's fine depending on what your goal is. But if you just want to get bigger and stronger, like, just do the basics and work to lifting more, and that will get you there.
Yeah.
And this comes again from a guy who wasted more time doing bodybuilding stuff than I'll ever care to admit.
Yeah. I think we've all been there,
Yeah.
especially. Yeah. So speaking of the heavier weights, when when and how many times should you be maxing out per year? And with that, and because I know that we maxed out a little bit differently at UW
Yep.
Lacrosse. We did 3 to 5 rep maxes, and it was aiming for 5. If you some variance, you could play with it if you put too much on or not enough weight on, that
Yep.
kind of thing. So maybe how many times and when, depending on the season, should you be coming close to peaking in season? Should it be more off season? Like one of the questions that I've been asked multiple times is for a football season, do you max out multiple times in an off season? Is there one in February, March, and then August or late July, or is it just a slow build up that mountain all the way to August? Or so could you speak on that a little bit in terms of kind of the peaking? And this would just be for the weight room portion of
Yep.
it.
So 2 times a year, I think, is plenty. Depending on the sport, maybe you could argue a third, depending on the season. But football again, just being our example here, we did it January when everybody came back. We kind of built it into the workout. and then again sometime during the summer to again kind of see where you're at. That summer one can be a good or a bad thing, because if they're not stronger, is that a mind meld for the person?
Yeah.
Does the strength coach stress about it? Like, yeah, so you got to have it kind of take it all with some, context there on what you're doing with it. But that's also part of the reason that we tried to focus on a 5 rep max, which we would then put into a prediction equation, which has been shown to be pretty accurate. Multiple reasons for that. And there is a 3 rep version too. Similar equation does kind of the same thing. One was safety. You
Yeah.
get somebody loaded up under a bar for squat, even bench, and it's the most they've ever done. Your injury risk of injury goes up pretty high, because you're ultimately trying to just move the weight. So technique can go out the window. There all these things can potentially happen with that. One that Dr. Wright would always argue is, you know, you could feel amazing the day you squat for that, 1 rep max, and you blow it out of the water. Well, the next time you did it, you were up all night because your girlfriend broke up with you. You were pissed off about it. Like you didn't sleep good. You didn't eat anything. And you come in and sure, you might be stronger, but just that mental state of it may have a significant impact on your ability to perform that single rep max. And so that's why we liked using the 5 because it gave a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how people were feeling and different aspects of it. Always goal was 5 right on the nose, but we could make it work with 4, 6. But you could also really get a good idea of like as you were warming up and just knowing from your training based on how previous sets of 5 reps had gone about where we needed to be. And so that's what we were always looking for there. Um, I don't know if you were going to ask this, but it just made me think about it. Our goal for this, and generally speaking, was a 1.5 times bench press of body weight and a 2 times squat. Um,
Can you talk about
generally,
why those numbers are important? Because I've heard this before, on social media and whatnot,
yep,
and it changes a little bit, but people kind of have that as the gold standard for, especially when it comes to NFL guys.
yep,
I heard something yesterday about what is it worth going past,
right.
those figures. So could you touch on why those are important and why those are really good markers to have as a strength or just an assistant coach?
Yeah, and some of that is, it's all sport contextual.
Yeah.
A women's soccer player or even a men's soccer player probably doesn't need a 1.5 times their bench press because it's not a lot of stuff that they do for their sport. Um, but those are generally kind of accepted as really good benchmarks of strength. And I think a lot of it for us came by is like we wanted to see that so we know people were quote unquote strong enough. But then you kind of start looking at like, okay, force and power are, how strong you are, but how fast you can move it as well. So at what point is how strong is strong enough? So if your predicted max for squat is 500 pounds and you're a 225-pound linebacker, does getting you to 505, 510, with that make that big of a difference? Or now can we kind of focus on like, okay, we've got the strength part. Now let's focus on the speed part and really combine that together to make that power equation go up. Because we,
Yeah.
we may need to focus on that because there's more we can get out of that speed component. And than we would if we just tried to keep adding strength. So at some point, you got to look, is enough in order to do what we need to do in regards to what their athletic performance is.
Awesome. I'm glad we touched on that because yeah, I don't know if some high school coaches might not have a marker besides like I still hear about people going off of like percentages of last year,
Yep.
and not really have like which is great for like the building blocks, but if you want to get to like a point of really having full control of your body, you should probably be closer to those numbers. So
And it's
um
all again, weight room numbers are amazing,
yeah.
but what are they doing on their sport? We had people that were awful in the weight room, not super strong, just it wasn't their thing. They weren't great in the weight room. but boy, could they wreck somebody on the field or on the court or whatever it was. Like that, they still thrived. Does that mean we were awful as strength coaches? I would argue not, but that just is what it was. Conversely, we had people that were studs in the weight room,
Hmm.
and you just look at them and be like, they got to crush it. And it never translated for them over to their sport. And that may just be what it was. It wasn't at fault of anybody from the athlete to the coach or whatever. It just happened to be what it was. And so it's all contextual of what the ultimate outcome is. So
Yeah.
you can't live or die by the weight room numbers
Right.
and predict performance on their sport. It never is quite that simple.
Yeah. Yeah, that is true. And it's definitely something for coaches to keep in mind. Like, I played 8 years, college and competitive high school ball. And, you know, I don't think any of the best players I played with were breaking records, in the weight room. It's just kind of
Sure.
how it went. I'm sure there's guys out there that have done both. But I saw it as the guys that were hitting pretty close to those benchmarks, and that was like their peak, was like that was it. They weren't and it usually wasn't huge numbers. It was their body weight, they were fit, and they were controlling their body really well. So
Right.
um all right. So what the last thing I wanted to really touch on, what like I have intentional speed question mark here, but the overarching question is like training intentionally to have better full control of your body. As at least that's what I remember was kind of our overarching goal was like at the end of the day, yes, we want to be bigger, faster, stronger, but if you can move your body better, have better control, be looser, more flexible. Um, I guess, do you have any maybe advice for coaches or programs or even individuals on just kind of touching on that? Because I think a lot of people, whether it's strength coaches or whoever, get caught up in the bigger, faster, stronger still.
Yep.
And, you know, better body control, better body, everything I just talked about kind of gets like either a passenger seat or a back seat to that stuff. So I guess maybe talk about how that was like a main overarching goal in our program and how it worked.
Yeah. So I think it kind of comes back to is again, what are your ultimate goals? I know we had the conversation I had a few times with some athletes of like, well, why aren't we working on start speed? Or why aren't we doing this? And, or we aren't doing these agility drills. Well, the 40-yard dash is a skill. Like, yes, it is it tests how fast you are, but there is so much skill that goes into how you do that, but it doesn't necessarily translate to the field. So yes, if you're going to go to the combine and it is going to be the difference between, millions of dollars, absolutely. But for a high school or Division 3 athlete that isn't to that point yet, or what may never get there, it isn't adding much, in my opinion, to what you're doing. So spending time on doing that or the pro agility drill, again, there are coaches that make a lot of money teaching the absolute most efficient way to do that, which is great, but it doesn't necessarily translate over to your athletic success. And so I think not being afraid to do the basics. The single leg jumping over hurdles. It's harder. It seems easy. It's harder than it looks. um, I forgot to mention it earlier, and it just came to me as you were asking the question. Med ball work,
Mhm.
focusing on slams, explosion, rotational throws, all these other things that are going to kind of tax your body in a different way is going to develop those power things. And then again, it sports specific, I think, comes into context here because how you train a soccer player versus a volleyball player versus a basketball player versus a football player, they each have their focus. Having a volleyball player or a baseball or softball player do long, slow distance runs to me makes absolutely no sense. Like you're probably going to set them up for more aches and pains and injury that could prohibit them from doing what they need to do. Volleyball players, it's not there. Yeah, you need a little bit of conditioning, obviously, for the game, but you could do that through repeat things that are short. Try and make them not super load bearing. Basketball players probably don't even need to run as far as football players do just because of the nature of the court. But it's got to be repeated kind of high intensity as you start getting close because that's the game. Soccer, maybe less of the repeat high intensity. Obviously, that happens in the game, but they are doing a lot more, just, that's equivalent to long, slow distance. Again, I wouldn't have them go out and run 5 miles, but I would change how we're building out our conditioning program there versus football. Focus on lateral movement and actually pushing off with that leg. I can still hear Dr. Wright yelling at people to push with that motion because they don't. They're trying to pull themselves along, which you're probably going to pull a growing, but you're also not getting as much speed as you need to. And so don't overcomplicate and know that the basics are probably going to take you farther. And I think, where we were located, and I don't know the whole program, but like Caledonia football, small town, apparently some good genetics in there, but like they have been and were dominant in football. And they had some really good coaches, but I can't imagine that most of what they were doing was anything beyond getting ruthlessly good at the basics. And because they bought in and were so good at those basics, it translated to their success. And they were just doing that better than everybody else. And then it transferred to the football field, and they've had their little dynasty there. And I think that's ultimately where we saw a huge transition with, you know, your group and just everything there. Is there were a lot of factors, so I can't pinpoint it to anything, but we got really, really good at the basics. And I think we saw the perks of that. And obviously, good athletes coming in and everything helps a ton, but
Yeah.
just the basics were so important um, to that. And I think it showed.
Yeah, I think there's, maybe it's just the world the culture we live in today with, young, sports, young athletes and, youth sports and high school sports and college sports of just trying to be, and probably the NFL too, and professional sports. But, we all want to try and reinvent the wheel to get the leg up in our program to do the weird thing that gets us to a national championship,
Yeah,
right? So that the next year when you're talking at a coaches conference, you can say we did this weird thing and it got us a championship.
right.
But I think that might be step 6 or 7. Once you get one buy-in from your team, like you can have the best program on earth, but if 4 guys are showing up to do it, it's like, well, you're not going to win that many ball games.
Sure.
You don't even have squat down yet. There's some of those things. So yeah, I think you hit it on the head of just there we go. You back? Okay.
Apparently, Jesus, I think it's a sign.
Yeah. Maybe we should keep it to 45 minutes next time. We would have been a-okay.
There you go.
All right. Um,
And just to sum up, I think I know what you're getting through, and most of it, you know, the fancy stuff that the elite level do is because a half a percentage point makes all the difference at that level.
yeah.
I think focusing on again on what's going to get you 10 percentage points at the younger level is what you got to do. Similar thing, and we'll talk about this probably on the next one. Nutrition versus supplements. If nutrition isn't there, there's no supplement in the world that's going to make it better
Yeah.
for you. Again, everything you were saying, if you don't have the basics down, throwing all these other things at it probably isn't going to make as big of an effort as a change as you think it should. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we'll go into it next time, but like if you're eating, like crap at home, but you
it
have protein powder, that, doesn't matter.
doesn't
Um,
cancel each other out. Yeah.
and this is a preview to next time, but what the biggest question I get is like, how do I get kids to eat more in general and all that stuff. So, um, I'll look forward to breaking this stuff down and having a bunch of questions for next time we get back and do this. But, yeah, get good at the basic stuff. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's stupid. It's probably the thing that will improve your program.
Absolutely.
So yeah, well, all right, this was awesome. thanks for having me on, Joel. And like I
Thanks for
said,
doing it.
next time we'll do some nutrition stuff. I will be doing a lot of listening because I did not pass my first biology class in college. So
We'll get AJ on for that one. He'll shed some light on everything. So, all
yeah, awesome. Well, all right. Well,
right, sir. Appreciate it.
you got it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Clinically Pressed. Please stay tuned for more episodes around nutrition, injury, recovery, all kinds of different things that we're going to cover when it comes to this topic. We appreciate you listening, and those series will be coming out soon. Check out clinicallypressed.org/shop for access to all our free resources. No payment information required. Just check out in the store for free, and we hope you find something there that's useful. We'll catch you next episode.